Welcome everybody. This is the chair. Welcome at Magazijn and welcome at the first event of Queer Currents to 2020. We're so happy that we can start. We're so happy that we can be together, at least in a small group. But it's so great to start off after like a few months that we didn't know if we could start, if we could do anything, and I'm totally fed up with Zooming, with everything that's online. So it's really great to see you all here and to touch each other a little bit and be alive again. So welcome. Queer Currents started actually 3 years ago, but last year we had the first events and the first edition. And Queer Currents is basically 15 events, 50 days, from 15 locations through the whole city of Amsterdam to give a little bit more content to Pride Week. Well, there is no Pride Week this year, but we really want to claim the Pride Week and be there, so we continue to organize it, and here we are. So it will be 50 days, 15 locations. You can view everything on www.queercurrents.com. And please know that you have to book your tickets online, because we don't let anybody in who just shows up. So you have to book your tickets online. We started last year to think about the program. The program is very diverse. It's changing. It's very because a lot of people suddenly are on holiday, which is also a big surprise for me. But I want to mention one person who's here in the room, Bob van Toor, and we started together. And then with all the love, we separated a little bit, but you're here, so it's great that you're here. And then suddenly, of course, we had the amazing Kip Republic jumping in after doing the project. They were free, they had nothing to do, so there they are. So it's amazing to have you on board. And well, the last 2 weeks we did a lot.
Yes.
And so the whole program is there. And it starts now. And it starts with you, Lynnée. It's great that you're here. First I give a little bit of word to Ira, but great to have you here, and hope to see you at more venues. Every day something starts between 5 and 7, but there are also things in the morning and sometimes at night. So check the program. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Also on behalf of Kip Republic, I'm very excited to be here. I'm here also because at Kip Republic, we believe that it's important to be part of anything that supports inclusivity, diversity, safe spaces for queer communities, and especially queer youth. I always like to emphasize that my sister, Ira Kip, and my partners, I should say, partners in crimes, Anna van der Ven and Ira Kip. I'm standing here representing them. I know they're also watching live today. We are just very grateful to be a part of this. So I want to thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for the opportunity to jump in. And Lynnée, you know, I'm just so happy that we are actually doing something with Lynnée again. To us, she's a you know a very important voice of the community. I don't want to label queer or Black, just community, period. And she's very inspiring to us. And yeah, I'm just so glad that we get to share her with you and that she wanted to be a part of this. So Lynnée, thank you so much for being here. And you can take the floor. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Can I sit? I wonder. This can be informal. Can you all see me from here? Can you hear me from here? Yes. Hi everyone. Wow, I'm a little. I think I might be a little bit like shell shocked about the fact that I am in a room with people right now. Like it's like wow, you know. I'm gonna have to unlearn these quarantine shelter-in-place practices, particularly as you all have imagined closely from a distance, the fuck shit that is happening in America, right? And the rising numbers of folks who are, being diagnosed and suffering and struggling through this disease because we have a system of white supremacy that is putting its foot down and doubling down on the fact that they don't really feel a certain kind of obligation or responsibility to folks who they consider to be essential workers, which in the States is typically Black and brown people. So I made it past the border here, which was amazing. My partner is Dutch. Her name is Chandra Frank, for anyone who knows her. And she's actually Dutch, South African, Indian woman. And we totally reached out to the border folks and just, the American ambassador here, let me in. Because I am now fantasizing about the notion of sort of becoming an expatriate and being based here in Amsterdam. I've been coming to Amsterdam for the past 5 years, so it feels like one of my homes. So I'm really grateful that this is the first place where I will be showing my work in this kind of post-pandemic context. Wow, post-pandemic context. Not even post-pandemic, in fact, but in this pandemic context. So I'm gonna stick to my notes because as a DJ, I can kind of go in different places really easily and kind of lose discipline around what I wanna say. So I'm going to read from my notes. You all cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that energy. Are you all excited to be in person too? I mean, I know that you all, right? I mean, but you all are around here, there are no masks, people are at the farmer's market. There's a different level of life being lived here that I hope you all understand. Somebody made some right decisions somewhere. I don't know what happened, but you all are able to, I was I'm only going to Amsterdam if I will be able to do two things, bike and go to the farmer's market. Northern market, if I can be there, then I'm there. So anyway, it was great to see, also to see the absence of tourists. I feel a little I'm like a guest in this space. I'm not a tourist this year. So I feel good about that status that I have as the sort of local resident. But my name is Lynnée Denise. And I am reading that. I do know my name without reading it. But I am going to say, also known as DJ Lynnée Denise. And I want to thank Queer Currents for trusting me to launch this year's program. That's a big deal. And yeah, I'm just trying to negotiate space. Do I hug people? Do I shake hands? What do I do in this space? One thing I will do is just simply talk about what it means to be here and present and queer and visible, which is what this talk is about. But I also want to say that I am super happy to be in some kind of partnership with both Ida and Ida, two folks who I've been in community with for the past 7 to 8 years, two women who really embody the notion of diaspora as a verb, diaspora as a process in which Black folk from around the globe collaborate and work collectively to investigate and interrogate and explore and draw inspiration from Black scholars and writers and activists and musicians, artists and educators from around the world, with the purpose of educating young people, which is how I came into contact with Ida and Ida, their work through Art Rules Aruba and Art Rules Carousel, and their mission to bring in this kind of international community to work with youth on the island of Carousel and Aruba, and also to sort of be cross-referencing and coming together to build a united front, one that looks at police brutality in America alongside the legacies of apartheid in South Africa and the post-colonial struggles in Africa, and one that examines the hostile and social political terrain in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And also beyond these shared but distinct struggles against white supremacy, I'm happy to have worked so closely with a number of artists and organizers here in Amsterdam to create programming around joy and pleasure, because Black folks are not out here just simply organizing and resisting. But we are also building, right? We're doing more than resisting. We're doing more than suffering, in fact, right? We are smiling, dancing, writing, thinking, like we are moving our bodies through this, and not just as a reaction and not just as a form of resistance. We are building on this notion of global Black excellence and rooting ourselves in these communal and ritualized cultural practices that speak to the interdependence and the interconnectedness of our communities, right? So I just really want to say thank you to Ida and Ida in particular, because they have been doing this work. If you mention their names in Brooklyn, someone will know them. If you mention their names in Johannesburg, they will be known, right? They are known in London, right? They are known in Berlin. They are known obviously in Suriname, in Curacao, and Aruba. And that speaks to their kind of global activism and consciousness. I'm just happy to be a part of that. So a little bit about my work and why I'm here. Interestingly enough, I was invited to speak here about, 3 days ago. 3 days ago. But I know that Ida had me in mind and she was gonna call me, and I think I appreciate her trust and just being like, I'll tell you about it on the day of. No, but she, on a couple of days before that, like, she did. She was like, and I need your title by tomorrow. And I was like, damn, okay. What that forces me to do is to kind of think about how I want to use this time and this platform that I've been given. Like, what is most important to say in this moment? So rather than having a fully fleshed out lecture or talk, I want to use media and these sort of experimental video short essays that I've been working on. I had some on as you all were coming in. I've done work on the life of Toni Morrison, the life of Nina Simone, the life of James Baldwin. And very much so spending time with Black expatriates in Europe, and also transnational sort of relationships that happen, especially in places like Amsterdam. So I wanted to kind of just use the video, which is like 10 minutes, to stimulate dialogue between us all about the topic of visibility and invisibility and representation of queerness and the matter of Black lives globally. So that said, here's the foundation from where I stand. I come to you as a DJ born in 1975. Oh, I thought you all were gonna be surprised because I look so young. I thought there was gonna be a huge like, oh yeah, okay, true. Okay, my bad, I was waiting. 1975. Thank you. It's funny you say that. It's avocado. It's me, not eating animals. It's, it's a couple of things, some of that pleasure we talked about. So, so I was born in 75, and that is to say that my practice and my scholarship is rooted in a sort of a listening practice, and one that I call DJ scholarship. DJ scholarship is a sonic liberation practice that I use to interrogate systems, to understand the interior lives of the artists I love, and to contextualize music of the Black Atlantic as a way of employing a certain kind of what I call a geomusicology. In other words, DJ scholarship concerns itself with the notion of music and place. Music and place, right? So I say Atlanta, you might say Outkast. Right? I say London, someone might say Soda Soul. I say Detroit, someone might say techno. I say house, someone might say Chicago. I say gangster rap, someone might say LA. I say reggae, someone might say Jamaica, right? Like music and place. But to take that beyond the simple kind of exploration of music or these regional rhythms, I'm also wondering, okay, what is reggae music looking like in this post-colonial context? What does this kind of post-British colonial rule produce for artists? What is South African house in the post-apartheid context, right? So not just trying to understand music because I love it and I'm a DJ, but understanding the rich stories that are embedded in music, and that globally, any Black person who's been touched by the transatlantic system of slavery has an interesting story to tell, and tons of those stories have been told in music. That is to say that music stands as a whole separate institution of cultural history, right? That you can comb through the lyrics of reggae songs, of garage songs in the UK, of what, you know, trap music, and you will find the stories of communities and peoples, right? So when I talk about DJ scholarship being rooted in exploring the interior lives of the people that I love, it means that my love for Nina Simone doesn't stop at my, you know, my just like intrigue with her musical genius, but I am interested in why she began to take antidepressants. I'm interested in what happened to her when she moved to, please don't let me mess up this word, Nijmegen. I'm interested in what, you know, her relationship with her daughter and how it was complicated by the hyper exploitation, right, that she experienced under the hands of the American music industry. If I talk about Michael Jackson and say, you know, these sort of recent allegations that have gone on around sexual abuse, I'm curious about the long history of sexual violence against Black men and how they, in turn, you know, reproduce those forms of violence and enact those forms of violence on both children and or women. I'm always asking about where and why. I never stop at where the story begins in the media, but I'm asking, what do we understand about this when we think about it in the context of the afterlife of slavery? Right? Because we are not separated from the living legacies of slavery. And again, when I talk about slavery, I'm always conscious of place. Not everyone in the room, especially if I'm in Amsterdam, understands or experienced that context in terms of slavery as it relates to the Americas. I get that. But I also know the Dutch's role in it. I know that the Dutch were some of the first to institute branding on those bodies, right? I know that the Dutch were the ones showing up with, you know, excitement about the gold and the spices, right? So yes, it didn't happen here, but this is the place where the thought began, right? So this is kind of what I mean by the interior lives of these artists. I'm also a professor at the University of California, UCLA. Yeah, it's too much, I can't be doing all that. At UCLA, and one of the things that I tell myself, I teach a class called DJ culture and music migration. And one of the things that I say to them on day one is we are about to think about Black music beyond entertainment. They're like, what do you mean? We are about to think about Black music beyond its entertainment value. So we are gonna dive deep into what Kanye is talking about. We're gonna dive deep into what the hip movement of Beyonce, you know, means and what it communicates about Texas, right? And by the end of the class, they're like, we totally get it. Lyrical analysis, understanding, you know, representation, the history of exploitation of these various industries that Black artists find themselves involved in. So the title DJ for me, in the true sense of the art form, implies decades of rigorous and focused study that for me begin with the ungendering of technology or technological literacy. So, you know, oftentimes we think of the DJ quite honestly as a cis male, right? And then we might throw the word female in front of it when we're talking about, oh, that's a female DJ. It's like, but you don't say male DJ, right? So what you're letting me know is that female DJ is the exception, right? And that males, men, and people who identify as men are the sort of real representatives of the culture, right? So for me, that started with being committed to learning about turntables and mixers and beatbox machines and and music software programs so that I could communicate sonically what I'm thinking about. So you all with me? Thank you. So the ungendering of technological literacy, the production of non-traditional scholarship. See, I snuck into these universities. I don't think I was really the person who they had in mind to be there. I went ahead and got some of these degrees so that I can put a foot in, but also keep the other foot in the community. I'm on the margins of the university and I'm fully rooted in community. So that's sort of like where this notion of non-traditional scholarship comes in and the privileging of different forms of knowledge production, right? I'm a student of Antonio Gramsci, right? The Italian activist who introduced us to the phrase organic intellectual. What does it mean to be an organic intellectual? It means that you can be an intellectual outside of the institutions that deem you an intellectual, the westernized universities. What I know for sure is that my functionally illiterate great-grandmother from Mississippi was an intellectual. Because especially if she were alive now, she would be able to tell me what kinds of foods we need to plant in order to not have to go to the grocery stores and risk our lives. She would tell me the multiple uses of aloe vera. She would talk to me about what it means to use castor oil as a way to kind of heal certain ailments that you might have. My grandmother, as functionally illiterate as she was an intellectual. Right, so what my work does is centers the intellectual prowess of folks who are imprisoned, undocumented folks who don't get to be considered fully human, right? And people who are, you know, maybe underemployed. And so those are the folks that I privilege in my work. And also this notion of radical interdisciplinarity. And I focus on these sound and visual projects that honor the musical genealogies and intellectual traditions of Black women and queer people. So the 1980s, I'm very drawn to the 80s. As I said, I was born and raised I was born in 1975, so I was raised in the 80s. And I consider myself to be a witness of the 80s and a survivor of the 80s. That is to say that I survived Reaganomics. I survived the introduction of another global pandemic called AIDS. I survived the war on drugs. Clearly I'm talking about an American context. I survived the 600% increase in the incarceration of Black and brown people in the 1980s because of drug addiction in the 1980s. What that means is that when I think about this in the context of being a DJ and queer cultures in particular who were really vulnerable, obviously, to AIDS and addiction and struggled with different resources and was on the margins of a lot of this kind of ACT UP activism that happened in New York, the Black and brown folks on the margins of those movements were living their lives in these interesting ways. We had sanctuary places called ballrooms, right, where we could go and be at home and have mothers and have fathers and have family. But I thought about the role of the DJ during that time. As I mentioned, Reaganomics and the defunding of social programs, the hyper sort of homophobic rhetoric that shaped the public discourse around AIDS that came from the Reagan administration, the drug use that was criminalized, and the disappearing bodies because of it. I saw bodies disappearing in my community / home, right? In my home and in my community and in the state and in the nation. So we got phone calls. Your uncle has AIDS. Your sister's in jail, whatever it was, right? And many of us had these phone calls where we were learning about the disappeared in our communities. And so I was thinking about the role of the DJ being here. This is interesting. I'm actually sitting in the position of the DJ. You guys are on the dance floor. Now imagine the number of bodies that begin to disappear on the dance floor that DJs were witnessing. DJs were witnessing these bodies disappear for various reasons, right? So some of those DJs disappeared as well. And so, you know, I think about this in a US context. And while this was an incredibly hectic time, there was also, you know, not just a massive amount of death and suffering and the disappearing of bodies, but also this is one of the most just wealthiest forms or wealthiest times for cultural production globally, right? My context is the States. I'm thinking about what gets born out of 1979 and then what shapes the entire decade of the 1980s. We're gonna bring that right back to Black and brown communities through the notion of disco. It is disco that gives birth to punk, that gives birth to house, that gives birth to hip hop, that gives birth to techno. It is disco. It is a Black and brown, queer, women-centered, feminist-led disco sound that shapes the entire sonic soundscape of the 1980s in the States. It's disco, right? And so this movement against disco, this anti-disco movement, this disco phobia was in fact a reaction to the presence of these Black and brown queer people who were centering the sexual desires of themselves and also women. For example, Donna Summer, raise your hand if you're familiar with her. Donna Summer has a world record in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the longest simulated orgasm on an album. Ooh, love to love you, baby. And she moans for more than 10 minutes. She moans. And when you think about that, when you think about where and how Black women have experienced globally these kind of violences against their bodies that get erased in the narrative of what violence is, it's powerful that her contribution before leaving this earth is to have simulated a 10-minute orgasm. I mean, what? I want that to be my legacy. I want someone to say that she had a 10-minute orgasm. That's what she contributed to the dance floor and to the sort of sociological climate of that time, Donna Summer, right? So just thinking about the 80s and the way that this, that in the States in particular, the way that disco and queer culture gives birth and contributes to the emergence of all these other forms of music. But a lot of times, particularly in Western universities, hip hop and jazz are sort of those genres of music that get explored. But in the 1980s, when I talk about this cultural production, we are also talking about a proliferation of Black women writers, fiction writers. And so the diasporic piece is interesting in that when we talk about New York, and I say I'm talking about it from an American context, how often is it really just strictly an American context? Certainly not in New York, where there's a huge Caribbean, continental African Latinx community that had been migrating to places like the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn for years. So what do I even mean by Black American? What do I mean by American, right? We are not talking about America absent from the many immigrants that brought culture to the place. So you cannot talk about hip hop and not mention a Jamaican sound system. It's impossible, right? You can't even talk about disco and not think about merengue and salsa. You can't do it. You can't talk about house music and not think about African polyrhythms, particularly West African polyrhythms and improvisation and call and response. All of these things are rooted in a diasporic culture, yeah? So even when I talk about, hip hop, I just want you all to know I'm talking about Kingston as well. I'm talking about the Bronx. I'm talking about Puerto Rico. I'm talking about Brazil, when you even think about the relationship between breakdancing and capoeira. Did I pronounce it right? Capoeira, right? And I'm thinking about, Mayan, Aztec culture, Egyptian hieroglyphics and graffiti, right? So what are we talking about here? So I refuse at this point in my life to talk about America as this isolated, exceptional place. It is not shit without diaspora and migration. Actually, it's not shit without illegal immigration. I am glad that some folks snuck in there. Had it not been for them, we would not have these multi-billion-dollar industries, right? So this is the truth for me. And then globally, in the 1980s, I'll tell you all a quick story of how my world changed with one single Soul Train episode. I was minding my own business. I was at my house in the morning. My mom, she plays music. We're cleaning, I'm vacuuming. That was my job. I did it well. My sisters are doing this, we're doing that. And we are getting ready for Soul Train because we know that whatever my mom and my sister who's older have been listening to, those artists are going to be performing on Soul Train. So, just so happens that Loose Ends, you all familiar with Loose Ends? Okay, Loose Ends, right? Loose Ends, I'll break it down for those of you who don't know. Loose Ends is on there singing one of my favorite songs. I was like 9 years old. The song was called Hanging on a String, Contemplation. Again, minding my own business. I'm listening to Don Cornelius, who was the host, step up to the group and interview him as he normally does, and I hear a Black British accent. And I'm confused. I'm confused because first of all, I know all their songs and I don't have a Black British accent. But I'm also confused because I didn't know that Black people existed outside of Africa and the Americas. We didn't have Black British lessons. We weren't learning about the British Empire and its impact on Jamaica, right? And on Barbados, and on Nigeria, and on, South Africa. We didn't know I didn't know what folks meant when I was 8 years old about this, the British Empire sun never setting. I didn't know. I didn't know why or how there were these people speaking English, these other Black folks, right? So again, then my informal education comes from Soul Train, not just my grandmother who's functionally illiterate and an intellectual, but also Soul Train, right? The music piece. And so that was my introduction. And I remember my mom being like, oh, you like that? Well, Sade's from over there too. What? Sade's from over there too, right? Is what my mom said. This distance that's been haunting me all my life because I've been trying to close the gap. Because I'm bored to death with Black American exceptionalism too. I'm bored to death. I'm bored to death because I want us to know more, which is why I'm in the education system. So these students don't leave my class without being able to articulate a well thought out understanding, of diaspora as a process, an echo chamber even, right? So Bob Marley and the Wailers, yes, who started out as doo-wop singers in the 50s. Or, his mother, Cedella Marley, who was listening to the gospel greats from Detroit, right? And so, or Miriam Makeba, who, depending on who you might ask, is maybe one of the queens of beatboxing. Maybe. This sound, this click, this cosa, this sound, right? That Black people, these sounds, this acoustic, this use of the body as an instrument. The use of the body as an instrument, and also the body as technology producing these industries globally, right? Not just the picking of cotton in America, but the cutting of sugar cane and on the islands. So you know what I'm doing? I'm getting off track. If you want to know, I'm off track. So I'm gonna bring it back because what are we doing for time? 30 minutes. Okay, thank you. Oh, maybe I'm okay. Okay, that was an intentional tangent. So, so that global piece, all right. And while this is so that global piece, and yes, massive amounts of death and the disappearing of bodies, but then also this cultural outpouring that happens with feminist-led presses like Kitchen Table Press, which was a press that was founded by two twin queer sisters, Beverly and Barbara Smith, and that published the work of Chicana feminists and of indigenous feminists who were working with the American Indian movement to talk about intersectional feminism. And to call to account these sort of patriarchal notions of Black nationalism that was happening globally. And so the 1980s is just a super fruitful time, so much so that part of what I did, I had an artist residency at Stanford University this past winter, and I taught a class called the Black Music 80s. And so much of the work focused on the transnational community building that came together during that time. Amsterdam has this incredible history of people coming here and building with your scholars, building with Gloria Becker and Tanya Leon, building, you know, with the BMR movement. And I know some of this because my partner's work looks at Black and brown feminism in the 1980s here. And so I would just be like literally in the archives with her and looking at who came here in the 1970s and the 1980s, not just to perform, but to be in conversation with the folks who were organizing here. And there was a major, interesting sort of like trifecta of organizing. It was like folks from here, and of course the roots in South Africa, folks like Tanya Leon and Gloria Becker from Suriname, but then also, you know, thinking about and troubling the notion of political Blackness in the UK. And then these American activists like Angela Davis, who came here to study what the prison population was like for women here. And so this, and Bell Hooks was someone who came here. James Baldwin spent time here. Nina Simone lived here shortly. And so I just was just curious about who they were talking to on the ground here, right? And not just stopping at, ooh, they came here, right? But thinking about, no, who was here? Who did they come here to? What were they here talking about, right? To not erase the people they were in conversation with and being shaped by. Because this notion of like, I mean, I have to resist this is when I travel the world, like that I make sure that I'm not showing up as a Black American missionary. Like, hey, I'm here to show you who we are and to help you, you know, to help you learn more about who we are, right? You know, right? Like, no, I am here to learn. I'm here to learn. And I appreciate that Angela Davis came here to learn, and that she ended up being on the PhD committee for Gloria Becker when she was at UCLA. Like that's the Alice Walker, when she was doing, you know, research for some of her novels in conversation with some of the Black feminists here, right? So you know, so just thinking about that 80s piece and technology in particular, and the Black gay liberation movement with people like Marlon Riggs and Essex Hemphill, of course, Audre Lorde, and just, you know, sitting with all those interdependent connections. So maybe I'll just skip a lot of this. Well, it's just, at this point it's still. So, okay, I did a project. I was a resident here. I was an artist in residence at Civica, and I did a project called the Belmer 80s. And I learned so much about Surinamese sort of like post-disco music that came out of the 80s here. And I lived in the Belmer, and I did these sort of like, I filmed these oral histories. I worked closely with Simone. You all know Simone? Jay-Z? Yes. And Ernestine. Yes. And the Belmer Park Theater, like those folks just like told me these histories, you know, and Patricia, Quincy, like those are the people. And also Smita, just the poet, who's absolutely, you were in the audience at that, but just the work you're doing with poetry and just, right? So just wanted to acknowledge that and think about who's in the room. Cheers to Jennifer and the Amsterdam Black Heritage. But like y'all are the people who I talk about at home. Like, oh, you're going to Amsterdam? You need to get with Jennifer so that she can teach you the history of these canals, so that you won't be tempted to take these pictures of the canal and not understand, you know, the history of colonial waterways here in the Netherlands, and the way that Jennifer has done her homework as a scholar and a historian of Amsterdam is helpful. And I always send folks there to do that work and to do more than be a tourist here. So I want to get into, okay, so here's the thing. So I did that, you know, Belmer 80s project, and looked at the South Africa 80s, the decade of resistance, and again, the Jamaica sound system, dance hall 80s, the London Black British 80s, lots of organizing and social upheaval happening in all those places, but that's where I'm rooted. And the 1980s, activism and cultural production happened during that time globally. And so one of the things that came up for me when thinking about the Black Lives Matters movement, first of all, I am someone, this is a controversial thought, but I'm someone who will I will never mum the words Black Lives Matter. I just won't, because of course they do. And never am I going to say, but we matter. Never am I going to say that. I'm absolutely going to applaud and support those who are saying it and not judge it by any means, because saying it has also shaped policy in different places and certainly brought different forms of awareness. But there is a way that I want to engage my Blackness that doesn't at all involve the begging of certain kind of incremental changes. And also, I don't want to stop at the singular incident of Black people dying, in this case, George Floyd, because the number of George Floyds in America, but then the number of unnamed people globally that are victims of state violence, these hashtags are not able to capture the daily institutionalized violence against Black people globally. And so I just want language that that really honors the fact that these are not isolated and singular issues. They're rooted. Literally, you can't have white supremacy without Black death. You can't even have it. So I'm aware of the fact that I think sometimes it can take us off of the track, and or inspire or catapult us into deep organizing strategies and practices, right? So I'm just firmly saying that it's important that we hear different ideas. From me, you're gonna hear that I don't wanna say Black Lives Matter.
And what would you say is, if anything?
Yeah, that's the question, if anything. What I will say is what I will do is step into a classroom and prepare myself to have conversations, create lectures that raise the consciousness of students. That truly is my sole sort of, I think, outside of music, that's one of my primary functions or purposes in life, is to share what I know and to learn from these students as well. So I don't have a phrase. I mean, I did have a phrase, which was misery resistance.
Hashtag misery resistance.
Misery resistance. But then I read a book called The Sovereignty of Quiet by an artist by the name of Kevin Kashi, and he just spoke so beautifully about the notion of quiet in Black communities, like what it means to be quiet, not passive, not inactive, but quiet. The quietness of Black life is something that is underexposed because we are hyper visible. We are constantly resisting. So now there's a new phrase, joy as a form of resistance, pleasure as a form of resistance. It's interesting because I've been biking through, Bose Forest? No, just Bose is what it's called, right? The forest. I've been biking through this forest to get to Amstelveen. And I've been noticing these white Dutch children in particular having the time of their lives, jumping off of bridges into the lake, running free, not resisting. They're not having fun for the purpose of resisting. They're living. They're not out here having fun to resist, right? That's actually really important, to just be having fun as a human being. Not, you know what, this world is hard, I'm about to have fun. Like, you know what, I'm about to have fun as a form of resistance. What about fun as a human right? That doesn't require language to say, okay, now this fun is me resisting. It's not. I'm not resisting, I'm just living. I'm just living, because I deserve that, right? And I don't have to name it, I don't have to say, if I weren't having fun, I'd be organizing. I don't have to say that. So, I was just thinking about the 1980s as a jumping point, because I was thinking about Black queer culture, American Black queer culture, and the way that it has become this kind of global way of engaging queerness globally. So I was thinking about the word shade in particular. I was thinking about Beyonce, and her relationship to queer culture. And then I was thinking about the film Paris is Burning, and how Paris is Burning has become, again, this like monumental, and really one of the only documentaries that captures that 1980s time, right? And it's a film that I teach, but one of the things that I teach that is critically important, because everyone's like, Paris is Burning, yes, we're voguing, that's the ballroom scene, we got it. But within 5 years of that film being released in 1991, the majority of the cast died. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what that looks like. I want to talk about some of their gripes with Jenny Livingston, who directed it, and the number of, Black queer folks who felt like she exploited them. I want to talk about the murdering of trans women, which was also represented there. I want to talk about homeless youth, Black and brown in the film. And I just want to think about Paris is Burning, again, beyond its entertainment value. Absolutely.
Early to ask a question. So
Please.
do you think that the Netflix series Code resurrects or in some way retrieves some of that memory?
Yeah.
In a positive way?
Yeah, I love that question. And it's the reason why I love Pose. I watched it, I binge watched it, I developed a relationship. I'm in love with India Moore. There's different things where I'm like, first of all, I would like to be with India Moore, if you can hear me. I would like to be with you. India Moore is my type. I want to be with India Moore. India Moore is sexy and gorgeous and okay, but anyway. So, what was the question? No, okay. No, but Pose is a beautiful a place of departure. It's great because students now have some of the groundwork covered. Now, when I show them Paris is Burning, they feel bamboozled. Like, wait a minute, this has a 30-year history. Wait, what? Oh, this is what my mama was talking about. 1980. Wait, so what's his name? Pray Tell's role as the MC, as the narrator, as the oral historian, as the griot, right, of the space, as the holder of the container, that's a real life position. And that his position was inspired by a real life person, right, from the ballroom scene in New York. So I think Pose is a great intro, to the 80s, and a great way to, resurrect that moment. Absolutely, it's useful. It's important. It's useful to even have trans folks playing trans, to be even that level of I don't want to see Halle Berry playing it. You know what I mean? Just I don't want to see it, honey. I just want to know. I want to read trans literature. I want to see trans actors. I don't want to just see trans folks dying and only hear of them when they've been murdered. That's not how I want to, right? As a thinker, I want to know about, Sylvester, who was a disco queen, but who wasn't trans, but who introduced me to this notion of gender fluidity and gender nonconformity. So, and whose music will be played there. I was really impressed with Pose's homework around the time of music. It's accurate. And they do a really great sort of chronological exploration of the time, and the music is consistent with it. And they had a super important conversation about Madonna's role that I thought was really important, because Bell Hooks talks about it, eating the other is what she refers to it as. But I really appreciate that they talked about how Madonna was credited for introducing Vogue, and so shout out to Willie Ninja, right? Who is really, I don't know if you all have seen Paris is Burning, but he's the one who gives you the makeup, and he's telling you, and he's playing with you and giving you shade, as Dorian might say. But so yeah, I think that Pose is important, and I think it's a great thing to teach as a series in the classroom, and a way to engage that time period, which is a heavy time. It's a heavy time. So one of the things that I was thinking about, and I'll wrap up and then end with this film, and then we could just have, is that, you know, what is the cost of, well, first of all, you know, again, because I have my foot on the margins of the academy and my body rooted in community, I'm always hearing about citational practices. I'm always hearing about the importance of a good ethical citational practice. That is, cite Black women, cite Black scholars, cite scholars of color, cite whose ever work you use. But how can we cite queer culture, right? Because the word shade and what's the tea and all these words that are circulating globally without properly placing it in its queer context is a problem for a couple of reasons. It is not enough to care about the culture being produced by queer people. Like, you also have to be aware of the particular forms of violence that they experience. And then when we're talking about citing queer culture, citing people, it is connected to livelihood. And we're talking about trans people who are economically vulnerable, cannot have the same access and opportunities that we have to just go and get a job. I'm saying we as though that's not a problem for everyone. We know that there are distinct issues that all of us, based on our social positions, have to deal with. But when I think about Black trans women in particular, and the economic vulnerability that they endure, and then the ways that this culture is being sort of like appropriated, I'm struggling. Because I'm like, well, what would happen if we were citing these folks? And what would happen if the global sort of capitalistic economic boom that comes from these Black queer cultural ideas, what would happen if that money went into those communities? I feel the same way about techno music. Techno music is a multi-billion-dollar industry that has been lifted from one of the last Black communities in the States, which is Detroit, right? Which is a city in Michigan. And as you know, the neighbor of Detroit is Flint, Michigan. These are folks who struggle to have clean water. So what does it mean to not have Kevin Harris represent techno music or electronic dance music? What does it mean to have trans folks be able to get those jobs in the Hollywood industry? How does it then protect them from harm? What responsibility do we have to ask about the cultural context of some of the words that we use, like shade? So when I said hidden by the shade, the invisibility of Black queer life matters, I was thinking about the idea of how much we, everyone, takes from Black queer people. I was even thinking about the performance of Black film culture by white gay men. Honey, and all of that. While anti-Blackness fuels so much of the pride work moving through the globe. Right? Yes. Not, but yes, right? No, but that, and then misogyny. It's just, so yeah, what does it mean to be to be citing where you get these ideas from? And what does it mean to not? What does it mean to not cite you know, the words, the gestures, the sounds that you hear coming from Black queer communities? That's one aspect of erasure or invisibility that is connected to people's survival and economic livelihood. That's one thing. But then also to normalize it, to normalize Black queer life by maybe, you know, Beyonce deciding to show Messy Maya saying what happened in New Orleans for the opening of the song Formation, right? And I'll give you all context for this in the video. Messy Maya was not trans, but was a queer person from New Orleans. You all familiar with Messy Maya? You all familiar with Formation and the song? And it starts off with what happened in New Orleans and blah, blah, blah. And Beyonce was sued. Her estate was sued. She was sued by the Messy Maya estate for $20 million for using Messy Maya's voice without the family's permission. This is interesting. I'm someone who happens to love Beyonce. I think that Beyonce uses her weave as a percussive instrument, like, right? Like, that I think that I right? I also know that Beyonce is shaped by so many queer men, her choreographers, her stylists, and she talks about it now. She's been called out enough now to start naming people and to talk about these influences. Good for her. She's a Virgo. She didn't want to be out there being vulnerable to critique. So she corrected, she's correcting these things where she has participated in the erasure of queer people. So in the beginning of that song, we hear, whatever happened to New Orleans? We don't know who is saying this, because when that sound is happening, it's Beyonce who's emerging from a cop car in New Orleans, right? We don't know who Messy Maya is. So when I found out that Messy Maya was murdered in 2010, and that doesn't show up even as a, hey, this is dedicated, or hey, Messy Maya, it doesn't show up, and this person was murdered? Come on, no. So that's where I had to draw the line. I had to face the beehive and say, that is unacceptable. That's unacceptable. And then I ran. It's unacceptable. But, right? But I stand by it. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable that we don't learn this person's name who was murdered. Who was murdered about 5 years before the song comes out. It's unacceptable, right? So this is what I mean. What is it? And imagine, what if Beyonce simply said this song, because she rooted the song in New Orleans, what if she said, this is dedicated to Maya? And what if she then introduced the millions of people who follow her to someone who died at the hands of violence against queer people? What if one person, one fan, let alone 1,000, let alone 1,000,000, knew that she was referencing a queer person who had been murdered and changed their minds? She literally had the opportunity to save lives. It's that serious. It could have saved lives, right? To simply say, this is who that voice is. So that's one thing that I was thinking about in terms of erasure, right? And even though Black Lives Matters was started by friends of mine, Elisa Garza, Patrice, Opal, whom I adore, 2 of whom are queer, still the focus was on Black men dying. So they got called out because we are all indoctrinated by patriarchy. We know that we try, but we just can't muster up the care and concern for Black women dying. We try, but the George Floyd global kind of reaction didn't have the same kind of weight when we were talking about the woman who was killed within the same week, Breonna Taylor. But again, these names, right? Because the number of people who were killed during that week globally, ridiculous. By the state, ridiculous, right? So what? Bring it.
I gave myself that. I think I'm in a time warp in that when I first got here 8 years ago, my introduction exposure to the gay community was language through language.
Mm-hmm.
And the first reference I heard someone say they were queer or referring to the queer community, I thought, that is wrong. We don't say that anymore.
Yeah, dating.
So I miss the discursive term.
Yeah, come on. It's important. No, that's important. It's totally generational. I did not grow up calling myself queer. I do now. And I'm not even necessarily talking about my sexuality as much as I am my politics and my resistance to what is called normal, right? So but I think that it's a word that had been, it depends on what you're talking, because I know that you have I know that you have both a Black American and a Surinamese background, so that I know that
I
you.
grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
So you grew up in this.
Calm down.
Yeah. Look, you look at.
Just because the screen told me making you repeat the question, so open up the floor for questions, but repeat the question. Because
Yeah.
the mic is in
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
People can hear the question.
Okay, the question was sort of like, when do we start using queer as an umbrella term to describe sexuality as a whole? No, it's a preference. There are some folks who resist the title. The word.
You were starting to say something I think was very significant in that it doesn't just embody sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
That queer
Yeah.
identity also embodies the political,
Non-normative.
non-normative.
Yeah. Politics, radical thought, ways of being. So when I think about like this, I talk about like queering Aretha Franklin, for example. Even though I'm talking about like, say, when I talk about queering Aretha Franklin, when I know that Aretha Franklin comes out of the Black church and out of a gospel tradition that has a particular kind of relationship with Black, gay folks, especially in the 80s, and the silence around it, and just what Christianity has done on us globally in terms of how we process our identities, our sexualities, our desires. I was thinking about queering Aretha and thinking about her outside of the context of the church, outside of the context of her cis heterosexual identity, and thinking about how, for example, Luther Vandross worked with her on one of the most important songs in my life, which is called Jump to It, or thinking about the way that her songs have been remixed by house music producers. And so we get a different version of Aretha in this kind of, you know, when we frame her in this kind of what I call queer context, which is a context that includes house music, non-normative in relationship to what was considered to be normal in the 80s musically, which was hip hop and hyper-masculine, right? And even funk and R&B, funk in particular, which, you know, is a genre that is typically associated with like Black maleness, Ohio players, George Clinton, James Brown, you know, like, and not so much Shaka Khan, you know, Patti LaBelle, you know, Betty Davis, who? Donna Summer, right? So even queering that to talk about just resisting these kind of like heterosexual notions of who Aretha Franklin was, but also that I'm, you know, just thinking about what it means to even queer my politics. Queering my politics, of course, I know that Black life matters, of course. But me saying that I refuse to say it, I think is an extension of that, like queering my understanding of Black life mattering. Like I want to be able to say that through just, you know, through my work and my investment in thinking about Black music beyond its entertainment value, because that matters, of course, you know. So like, I think the queer is something that I would rather have people individually define for themselves. But I mean, in terms of, and I just, also the word lesbian for me doesn't feel, it feels like an ugly word. I'm a writer, and it feels like a word just like, am I lesbian? That doesn't sound like a word that I would use to describe, you know, and Black people, like lesbian, it doesn't ring true for me. Like when I hear it, I'm like, I'm not a lesbian. That's not a word that, but I am queer, I do like that. I am gay as hell, that helps, you know, like, but not, you know, not. So I think it's preference, and I mean, I also come from a hip hop tradition of renaming ourselves, you know, like we name ourselves, you know, Ice Cube, Ice-T, Queen Latifah, Moni Love, MC Lyte, you know, like we, Jay-Z, like we name ourselves, and I think that's queer, particularly again in a Black American context of losing our names, you know, like what it means to rename, in the movement of naming yourself, of renaming yourself. It's an intricate part of hip hop culture, is interesting to me, right? That what was rooted in graffiti culture, for example, was literally the kind of hyper visibility of the name you chose to be appearing on trains moving through the city. Your name that you chose, not a name that you inherited from a system that used your body as America's first form of technology, right? Like this is my body, I'm naming it, so I'm gonna call myself Lil Nene, Lil Kim, Lil Wayne, Lil Bow Wow, right? I'm gonna call myself these names, and you know, and just kind of and complicate the notion of identity. So cheers.
Oh.
Yeah. Go on.
I was wondering about you pondering on the notion of citing and what that could look like. And then I remember recently there was an event pre-pandemic.
Okay.
There was an event, I think, Vincent Lufada about citation, sampling in hip hop culture and how that. So I was wondering maybe
that's great.
what your thoughts are on sampling as a form of correctly citing, but how it can also, you know, if it's without context, and like Beyonce did where it can also just fall into the water and not work out.
I love it. What a question. Also, Teresa's a Capricorn, so that makes sense. And I'm a Capricorn too. So the question, say it again? So the question is, how do we really kind of unpack this notion of citational practices? And also, how do we understand sampling as a form of, as an extension of citational practice? This is great. That is a great question, because I think about sampling deeply as a citational practice, as a way to kind of, okay, so as a thinking about hip hop and sampling culture, and thinking about what hip hop became, which is a repository of ideas, of samples, of lost items, of sounds that these DJs and producers were just pouring into this genre. So we talk about hip hop as though it's just about this kind of beat in this MC, when in fact it's like, you know, the sampling of sounds, the sampling of ideas and speeches, the sampling of Black women artists. And I say that because sampling culture always comes down to artists like James Brown, who happens to be one of the most sampled artists in the culture. But so too was Aretha Franklin, right? So when I think about using sampling to figure out how Black women's voices were used to build the culture and the sound wall, that is hip hop, the sound wall. That is to say that because of sampling, hip hop is a genre made up of classic rock, of reggae, of soul, of gospel, of funk. That's what hip hop is like. It's not a beat machine and an MC. It's actually these people who were digging through the crates looking for samples. That is what we do. It is something that is inherently intellectual. So I believe that DJs are by default historians, cultural workers, digging through the crates of Black life, digging through the sonic life worlds of a global Black community to build a genre, an omni-genre is what DJ Spooky calls it, that is composed of layers and these sort of colors and textures, which is consistent with a lot of West African music, these polyrhythms, right? These many things happening at the same time. So you have groups like, you have groups like Public Enemy, who might be known to use up to 20 samples per song. Now, when you go and you chase those samples, you might land on a Farrakhan speech, you might land, you know, in a Claudia Jones speech, you might land in the sound of a screeching car, you might land, you might land in different places. So I think that is a citational practice is really important to think about, but at the same time, when we talk about citational practices and even intellectual property law, which is what we have to talk about if we're talking about sampling, then we do have to get into who regulates how we create these sounds, whose voices get sampled, how much we have to pay for those voices being sampled. Who do we have to pay when Aretha Franklin is sampled? Do we have to pay Aretha Franklin or do we have to pay Atlantic Records? You know what I mean? So then when we get into, so if you chase those samples beyond trying to be like, oh, that's my song, who's the original? When you chase those samples and say, wait, well, who's gonna reap the benefit of this being cited? And it's not us. So that's why Prince was walking around with the word slave on his face. You all familiar with when Prince was walking around with the word slave on his face, and then he released the album called Emancipation because he was struggling with Warner Brothers Records, and the way that Nina Simone was struggling with her record companies, right? And the ways in which Black artists continue to get exploited. So sampling becomes an interesting, hyper-political way to think about how we have been exploited in these industries, and a way for us to bring other voices and sounds and genres of music and introduce them to our communities.
I'm thinking TikTok.
Well, TikTok is just brilliant, I think. I can't believe what's happening in 60 seconds. I can't even believe it. But yeah, TikTok is a sampling system. Absolutely, it is a sampling system. And I don't know if you all had a chance, there's a DJ and a producer who I've been following, and he creates these videos, and I think he created one of the single most important videos that came out, again, in the context of America. I'm not sure if it made it here, but it's where like Cardi B is saying coronavirus.
Yeah.
I mean, that created that's a soundtrack. So
I'm kind of coming back to her starting about Pose and how these Netflix shows or like bigger shows nowadays are kind of like a jumping point for this generation to learn like kind of more like randomly about things and then starting to find out the history about it, which Pose really did for like Paris is Burning and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm because we're talking about sampling, I'm really wondering about your opinion on the Get Down. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah.
Because for me, I'm obviously like half in this community and half very much not. You can see. So I learned via these mediums.
Yeah.
And when I watched the Get Down, I was so touched by them touching on this very like shadowed over subject that was not like represented in a movement that started in obviously Black culture, but disco and hip hop started with like Grandmaster Flash and all that kind of stuff. But I'm wondering if that kind of representation is correct, because that's how people are learning, and it's so dangerous because then people take it as truth.
No, totally,
Which not
That's
always
great.
necessarily is. So I'm just wondering, because you're so into music and the Black culture and Black history, if those kind of shows are representing what the actual history is.
That's a great question. The question is, these are all really inspiring questions, like how can we learn from the dominant narratives that get sort of played out through these mediums that 9 times out of 10 Black folks don't own. That's very important. And so Netflix is not owned by a Black, but who is the producer of the show, right? That doesn't mean that Black folks don't have a role in producing these shows or a role in shaping the narrative, but I do want to talk about what narrative is, which is super subjective storytelling. Right? Like, and we also know that narrative has been used as a colonial tool. So my question is always like, who is shaping the narrative? So even in the case of the Get Down, which I'm not going to speak on because I haven't seen enough to speak on it, my students bring it to me, and and now that you've asked that question, I need to make it my business to go and sit with it, because I do teach about that time period in the Bronx of the late 1970s and the early 80s, and Grandmaster Flash and DJ Kool Herc and all those folks who are considered to be, watch my language, the founding fathers. And I'm always like, so I just want to know when there was a time in history when there were no mothers around. I just want to know where we were in that story. And I want to know where queer folks were in those stories. I want to know where queer folks were in those stories. So say, for example, another very controversial name that comes out of that time period that the Get Down focuses on, which is the late 70s and the mid 80s, is Africa Bambaataa. And that's a complicated story. It's a complicated story because these allegations around the sexual abuse of Black boys in particular, and the way that the hip hop industry, I'm generalizing, but the way that folks couldn't hold that conversation because we have built this narrative around the founding fathers, Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, Africa Bambaataa, no women in sight, no queer folks in sight. We built a whole story around these men who were isolated in the world by themselves, not engaged, not influenced by anything, not influenced by gay culture, not influenced by women, not influenced, but by the world around them, right? So I think that it's a great starting point, but if you are watching the way that I do with a critical eye, I oftentimes can't even concentrate because I'm like, hold on, Google. Right, I'm like constantly checking.
They're generally trying so hard because there's like the little queer storyline in there of this guy who is like this kind of more bisexual awakening. Because like it feels like they're trying really hard, but it still feels like it's obviously general because they need to tell the story in like a season or two, right?
Yeah.
And they touch on this, what you talked about, like this identity thing about graffiti.
Yeah.
They really touch on that in the show, like by picking your name and making it your own.
Oh, good.
And the very urban start of that hip hop revolution kind of started in the 80s.
Yeah.
But obviously they need to tell the story in the time they have in episode spans. And it's just not, it kind of felt like it wasn't a story that could be told in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, and that
They
too.
didn't have enough time.
That
relate.
makes sense. So so the question was, or the follow-up question was just like, yeah, that they are trying to kind of include these like queer, maybe that there's just like some subtext or like a sub-story around queerness, but also giving the history of maybe like the sort of foundational practices of graffiti culture and these things. But I am just always asking about, I just want to see more, I want there to be a direct kind of link between hip hop and queer culture and disco culture, because that's what it is. A lot of those DJs bought their equipment because they were spinning at gay clubs in the 70s. Africa Bambaataa is one of those people. He was going downtown, but it's not even just about making the money. We're talking about what I call musical cross-pollination, like where these people from Harlem and the Bronx and Queens and Staten Island and Brooklyn were going to downtown Manhattan where Basquiat was, right? And where Fab Five Freddy was, and where Debbie Harry was, and Blondie, and this punk movement, and these like, not just, this post-disco culture that shapes all of those genres. They were all in conversation with each other. They are all like a part of each other. Hip hop is, intricately linked to these other forms of music that we're developing in downtown Manhattan in particular. So, but what I'm saying is that I think it is our jobs. I think that what this moment is telling us is that it's our job to dig through the crates. It's our job to develop a set of questions when we watch movies, particularly coming out of the States. Like I will, when I started traveling in the early 2000s, I went to Ghana, and just some of the questions that I got asked reflected how people were learning about Black Americans, which was largely through television, which for Black Americans has been a historical enemy, an enemy industry that is looked to form policy. Okay, like that there is no separation between what Hollywood thinks and how these policies get enacted in our communities, right? And then how we have limited access and had limited access in how we shape this collective identity, which is a collective identity rooted in a lot of individual experiences, right? So I don't even know what I mean by a Black American experience. And that's why I was talking about also, lifting up the notion of the Black quietness, like, because that's not something that is promoted. The notion of like, what does it mean to not have this hyper public person, community being? What does it mean to just live? Yeah, period, to live. So the way that I'll end this is by showing you all just I've been playing with video and the way that I play with sounds, and just kind of lost and found objects and putting them together to kind of tell a story. And the one thing that came up for me, and it didn't come up to me until after I finished the video, it's almost like visual note-taking, so you'll be able to see my process, is that what is Surinamese gay culture? What's Jamaican gay culture? What's South African gay culture? How much do we know about Black queer cultures outside of the American context? And how much of what we know about these non-Black American Black queer cultures is informed by our belief that these folks are somehow more homophobic? That's actually very important, because Jamaica in particular, Uganda, these places get read as being these super homophobic, violent, dangerous places for queer people, without talking about colonialism. Without talking about the introduction of values to these folks as a form of, destroying the cultures that existed pre-contact, right? And the ways that, something that could be read as being gender fluid might be an intricate part of some kind of Senegalese ritualistic practice. Yeah. But what we get is, oh, be careful when you go to Rwanda, be careful when you go to Jamaica. And yes, I might need to be careful, but I also need to be careful when I take my ass to Crenshaw, right? Which is in LA. I might need to be careful when I go to Compton.
It's like you teach and then you criticize after the fact.
Well, no, I mean, for what I'm saying about that is like, I want to locate the role of white supremacy in the making of ideas and values.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Oh, okay.
Like back in the day, we taught a certain value, and
Yeah.
then like over the years, we come back and we criticize what we put down. We put the roots down for some sort of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and then it grew into their it grew with their culture, even though like we changed our culture, and then later we grew, and then we criticized the culture that we changed, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And that's what's been happening in those countries. Like you said, you need to be careful there, even though before we ever were there, that might have never even been an issue.
Yeah, I mean, but yes, that, and I want to say, the last thing that I just want to say is that also what does it mean for, the importance for me as a Black American to have the discipline to think about colonialism. This requires discipline, because America has taught me to center myself and my experiences, right? Like, and to not ask questions like, okay, so it wouldn't make sense for Black folks in Amsterdam to be talking about defunding the police. It wouldn't make sense for folks here to be talking about abolishing the police. This is a different context. What is the context here? What is immigration policy here? Like, let's talk about how Black folks are suffering here very specifically. And what if Black Americans then started to talk about, hey, well, listen, this is what's happening in Amsterdam. This is what's happening in London. This is what's happening in Eritrea. Like, what if we were talking about this on a global level? It would be scary as hell. It'd be scary as hell. It's what Martin Luther King started doing. It's what Malcolm X started doing, being in conversation with Kwame Nkrumah, talking about Pan-Africanism, building with Japanese activists. It's when Martin Luther King was like, hold on, let me actually recruit the white poor, because they too are suffering from capitalism. They too are being sent to Vietnam and being forced to fight on the front lines. They too. So what does it mean to have a united front? It means we must have the discipline to exercise intellectual curiosity about people outside of our own communities. We cannot organize without asking about and thinking about and forming questions around what is happening globally, right? So that's part of what this video will show, is just like, I wanted you all to get a definition, if you don't have it, of the term of shade itself, and the importance of even that when Black American language is appropriated. I oftentimes want to say, yeah, but check this out. That word is from Oakland. Oakland has a particular experience. That word is from Chicago. Chicago Black folks have but I also want to know what words are being said in Jamaica. I want to know what, I pay close attention to Black queer life in South Africa. Zenele Mahole is someone whose work I follow closely, because she is doing a whole lot of work to kind of combat gender-based violence there, and to think through some of the, just intense experiences that trans women and trans people are having in South Africa as well. So I'll show this video, and then I think we can end it. Or, I don't know if you have time for responses after that, but.
The sun's on.
Why is it off?
The sun, I don't know, but
Do you
you just
know?
switched it off.
Oh, I asked you. I like that I asked you. Okay, wait, what, the sound? What can we
It's
do?
just on the laptop, right? I saw it, you
Yeah, but it's,
accidentally pushed on it.
yeah, but it didn't even, it won't even,
Yeah, just push on like sound.
yeah, it did, it doesn't even.
Oh.
Okay, so let's just do a quick little old school, and let me just do this maybe. How are we on time? We can show a 10-minute video?
Yeah, we can, but maybe we just do it, privately, we back up the stream.
Okay, oh yeah, definitely. I'm not very shit. Sorry, y'all.
No shade.
Right? No shame.
So if you could just do some final words for the stream.
Okay,
And,
oh, I think,
okay.
okay,
Where's the, can watch the video of the things.
okay, hello, stream world. Okay, here we go. Right, that's true, it was global. I don't know why that is doing that, but, okay, there it is. So for the stream world, okay, so yes, so that's the tea, you know, no tea and no shade. No tea, no shade. So what I'm saying is that I am just honored to be here, and these questions are amazing, and this is my dream, because I wasn't trying to have a lecture as much as I was just like, hey, this is where I am at this point in my life right now. You might catch me next year being like, Black Lives Matter. You know, you might not, you know what I mean? But again, I wanna emphasize that I'm not so I'm reading a book right now called Lose Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman, and I would recommend anyone read it. Her work is incredible. She's an incredible thinker. But she just talked about the danger of appeal, what it means to have to appeal to someone for your humanity, you know? And like, so I've just been sitting with that, and I love I love how Black Lives Matter has mobilized a global nation. It is powerful. That is not, I'm not here to say like, nah, that's not for me. Like I said, I think it's important to just offer a different kind of perspective, which is to say, I'm one of those people that will not say that publicly. Because it does. Because it simply does. Publicly, as a part of my organizing strategy, I don't feel the need to say it, but I love how it felt to hear it being said around the world. But then I wanted to know, in what ways does Ethiopian Black life matter? In what ways does Jamaican Black life matter? In what ways does Black folks in Berlin? I wanted to know more. That I don't know. I want more about what is happening globally, and I want that to be like, I want a global call to action, a global paying attention to what's happening to us. That's what I feel. So thank you all for that.